So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 14 today. And what I want to do is I want to look at, it's honestly one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And if you've heard me teach before, if you've heard me preach, you know that I love stories. I'm a bit of a storyteller. I like to put myself into the story, get a lot out of it. This is one of my all-time favorite stories from Scripture. And it's a classic story of Peter, who is also one of my favorite characters. Peter's one of those guys that was slightly impulsive at times, right? He's the one that when Jesus is with the disciples and says, "Who do you say that I am?" he spouts out right away, "You're the Christ." But in the very next breath, when Jesus says he's going to have to suffer, he rebukes Jesus. That's always smart, to rebuke God. So he's this guy that always did things and then maybe would think about it afterwards. You guys know anybody like that? Where they say whatever's on their mind at that moment. You know exactly what they're thinking, even if you probably shouldn't. Peter was that guy, and this is one of those classic Peter stories where you just see, was he actually thinking in the moment? But that's part of what makes the story great. And it's also a great story where you can see what it looks like to act out faith, which is something that we all need to learn on a daily basis. We may have had a good day yesterday acting out our faith and living on our faith, but today's a new day, and there's new challenges. And so we have to be challenged again today to focus on God and to act upon the faith that we have. So Matthew chapter 14, we're going to be looking verses 22 to 33. All right, so join me as I read, and we're going to kind of work through it and talk about it as we go. Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds, he being Jesus. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now, we won't get into, this is a whole message in and of itself, and we're not going to get it, but I have to do a side note here. Jesus took time to focus on God and pray. Let that truth sink in for a second. Jesus was God in the flesh, the Son of God, and yet he still grew weary and tired and needed to get away and pray and focus. If Jesus, who is God, needs to focus on God and pray, how much more do we, who, by the way, are not God, how much more do we need that in our life? And there are multiple instances throughout Scripture where you see Jesus took time to pray. That's a whole message in and of itself, and we won't get into that this morning. But I have to point that out because every time I read that challenges me. If Jesus had to do it, how much more do I need it just to get through each day? And why am I neglecting it? But we'll continue on. After he dismissed the crowds, I'm in verse 23, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. Verse 25. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, this is the disciples in the boat, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. Can we blame them? Put yourself in that story for a minute. You're on a boat, out in a storm, out in the middle of water, and you see something walking on the water towards you. Right? How many of us are going to be like, "Oh, yeah, okay, cool. I saw that again yesterday. I saw that yesterday too." No, that's one of those things you're like, something's wrong here? That this isn't making sense. Because that doesn't happen. And so, of course, they cried out in fear, "It is a ghost." Verse 27, but immediately Jesus spoke to them saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." For a moment, just imagine what it would be like to be one of the disciples in the boat witnessing this. Now understand the fact that right before this story, the story before, they just witnessed Jesus take 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and feed a multitude of people. They say 5,000, but it's 5,000 men. They didn't count the women and the children that were also there. They only counted the men. So it could have been 15,000, 20,000 if every man had a wife and a couple kids with him. Jesus had just performed this incredible miracle of feeding all these people. The disciples witnessed this. I'm sure that's still in their mind. They're trying to figure out the math of it. How did that work again? We had 12 baskets left over. We didn't even start out with a basket. How do we have 12 left? And then they're in the boat during a storm, and Jesus comes walking to them on the water. I mean, just put yourself for a moment in their shoes and like, what is going through their brain? Their brain has got to be hurting at this point. All the things they're witnessing, because they're still learning and growing to understand who Jesus really is. They're still witnessing these things and being in awe as they happen. Now, this is where Peter becomes classic Peter. Verse 28. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. What? I'm sorry, what? Jesus is walking on the water, and they were afraid. But they've witnessed him do miracles, so they have some understanding that at least he can do something. Peter was a fisherman before this. Peter knows all too well you cannot walk on water. Peter knows this. And yet when Jesus says that, Peter's response is, hey, Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come to you. What are the other disciples thinking? I mean, are they like, well, that's classic Peter. Never know what he's going to do, and it's always entertaining. I mean, what's going through his head that's his response? But that's Peter. That's how Peter is. Peter, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. I wonder if there's a part of him that's like, please call my bluff. Please call my bluff. But Jesus is like, okay. He said, come. That's all he said. Come. Come on, Peter. You want to get out of the boat and walk on water? Do it. Do it. Now this again, and this is my mind and how I like to imagine the stories. I don't see Peter, the guy that does things and then thinks, oh, should I do that? As taking his time getting out of the boat. No, that would be too boring. That would be way too rational of thinking to be like, okay, I've gotten out of boats before and I never landed. I always sank. I don't see him kind of putting one foot over a little bit and testing it like we do when we're getting into a pool. We want to make sure it's not too cold. No. Now, in my mind, and again, I'm taking some license here, but in my mind, Peter jumped out of that boat. He said, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you. Jesus said, come. And so Peter, coming at you, and jumped out of that boat. You know, I mean, I don't really know, but in my mind, he did. He did. And what's crazy is when he jumped out of the boat, he stuck the landing. Peter was a fisherman by trade. He had been in the water for years. He had jumped out of boats, I guarantee you, at least a few times. Whether it was to get a net or whether it was just to jump in and cool off or go swimming. One of my favorite things to do when I'm in a boat is jump off the side while it's moving. It's so much fun. You know that Peter's done that. And he's never stuck the landing when he jumped out of a boat. He always sank and had to come back up for air. Like every other person ever. But this time's different. Peter jumps out of the boat and lands on top of the water and does not sink. What are the other disciples thinking at this point? You know, at first they're like, Peter's crazy. Now they're just in awe, like, dude, do you see what's going on? What's happening right now? They've witnessed one miracle, then another miracle, both done by Jesus. Now they're seeing something that Peter's doing that's just blowing their minds. Just put yourself in the story. I love this story for all that stuff. So verse 29, he said, come. So Peter got out of the boat. My translation, Peter jumped out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. So they're in a storm. They see a ghost, Jesus, walking to them. They're afraid. He says, don't worry, it's me. Peter says, hey, if it's really you, tell me to come to you. Jesus calls his bluff and says, okay, come on. Peter jumps out of the boat, lands on the water, and starts walking towards Jesus in the midst of a storm. In the midst of a storm, Peter is walking on top of water towards Jesus. But then, verse 30, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink. So then he started to do what we all do when we jump out of a boat. He began to sink. What was the common denominator there? What was causing him to be able to jump out of the boat and to walk on the water? Well, he was looking at Jesus. Not only that, he obeyed Jesus. Jesus is the one that told him to come. Peter had faith in Jesus. When Jesus said, come, Peter obeyed, and he was walking on water, focusing on Jesus. But then he saw the storm that was around him. Now, remember, the storm has been around him the whole time. It didn't start after he was on the water. It started while he was in the boat before Jesus even came to them. The storm has been going on the whole time. But suddenly, Peter notices the storm and takes his eyes off of Jesus. And he begins to sink. Like we all would. Like we all would. But this is the part I love. He was afraid and beginning to sink. He cried out, Lord, save me. So this is where I think a lot of times, maybe, and I know for me in the past, I've gone through this story. I love this story. Sometimes I miss this aspect of it. And when I was putting this message together, this wasn't originally the exact direction I wanted to go, but this phrase kept jumping out to me. Is that he cried out to Jesus when he was sinking. And I started thinking about myself in my own life. How many times do I try and turn around and swim back to the boat myself? Or look to the people in the boat and, hey, throw me a rope, throw me a life preserver, I need your help. And Peter could have done any of those things. Peter, I'm sure, was a strong swimmer. Like I said, he was a fisherman. But as soon as he started to sink, his eyes went back to Jesus. He remembered what was actually going on, why he had jumped out of the boat to begin with. He remembered who his faith was in, and he turned back to Jesus. He said, Jesus, save me. Verse 31, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And I have to believe when I read that, Jesus isn't rebuking him as much as he's saying, hey, you were doing it. Why did you start doubting? You were walking on water. Why did you start doubting that? Why did you take your eyes off of me? And then they got back into the boat, and the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. This is one of those classic stories of faith because you see Peter being willing to do something that's 100% faith. There is nothing about Peter that made Peter walk on water. There's nothing special about him. All he did was obey Jesus. And I want us to think about that. All it took for Peter to do something impossible was to obey Jesus. To hear what God said and to obey. And God gave him the ability to do something that was impossible. Walk on water. And as he looked at Jesus and as he kept his focus on Jesus, he was able to walk on water in a storm. Because he had his faith and his eyes in Jesus. But then the moment he took his eyes off, he began to sink. Why? Because it's not because Peter was the one walking. It's not because it had anything to do with Peter as to why he was walking on water. It was because of God. God gave Peter the ability to walk on water in that moment. All Peter had to do was obey. All he had to do was obey. And I love this story because we see what it looks like when we're willing to step out in faith. And there's some truths that I want to pull from this that apply to us today. Because I'm not here to tell you, go out today, get on a lake, say, God, I really believe I'm going to walk on water today. I have faith, and then jump out. Because I'll tell you right now, you're going to get wet and you're going to be cold. Because it wasn't just about Peter's faith in God as to why he walked on water. Otherwise, we'd all be able to walk on water. It was because he obeyed Jesus when Jesus told him to. And for us, we need to realize that faith starts with obedience. To be able to act out our faith requires us to obey. Be willing to obey. Like I said, all Peter had to do with walk on water was obey. For us to be willing to obey what we know God says, we first have to trust God. That what he says is good. That he's going to accomplish what he says. That when I read something in Scripture and it tells me to do this, I have to have faith in God. Because if I don't have faith in him, why would I obey him? If I don't trust that he has my best interest at heart, that what he says will come to pass, why would I obey him? Now, that's a very simple blanket statement. I think there's a lot of times we want to obey because we do have faith and we want to obey, but the questions start running through our head. Yeah, but God, I don't think you get it. It's not that simple. It isn't that easy. I don't think you know the situation I'm in. You don't fully understand. God, it's hard. It's really hard. No, you don't get it. It's extremely difficult. I know what you say. I know I'm supposed to trust you, but I don't see how it's going to work out. And so I'm afraid. I think that's a lot of times where we're at in our faith. It's not that we don't have faith, but we start to ask those questions. I know I've done them. We kind of start saying, yeah, but what would have happened in this story if Peter said, hey, Jesus, if it's you, tell me to walk to you. And Jesus said, come. And Peter goes, well, hold on a second. Let me think for a minute. There is a storm going on. And you know, I've jumped out of a boat before, and I didn't walk on water. And there's some people here who might make fun of me. I got to live with these other disciples all the time. And if I sink, they're going to never let me hear the end of it. I don't know, God. Maybe think of somebody else. Can you call someone else to do that? Because I don't know if I'm strong enough. I don't know if I have the strength to do that, God. I'm tired. You've thrown enough things my way. Do you mind giving that to somebody else? And the thing is, we think of storms, which is what's happening in this story. We always assume something bad. It's simply the idea of things around us in the world. Because we can get distracted and question and say, well, God, I'm not sure. When it's good things too. God, things are well right now. I don't want to lose what I have. I don't want to lose this comfort if I have to step out in faith and do something. I'm more comfortable just sitting in the boat watching. Which is easy. It's simple. Doesn't require a lot. Sitting in the boat did not require any sort of faith or obedience on the part of the other 11 disciples. And that is not a knock on them. Because I guarantee you, we'd all be sitting in the boat trying to figure out what's going on. But that's where you see the contrast between willing to obey and jump out and do what God says versus sitting there and watching. And we've all sat there and watched. I know I have. That's where it's comfortable and easy. That's where it's less messy. Life is very messy, and it's easier if we just hang back and don't get involved. But life has a way of continuing to come after us. It doesn't really work. So it requires obedience. Peter knew there's a storm. He knew that walking on the water was impossible. But he was willing to have faith and obey what Jesus said. And he was able to do something amazing. He had faith to focus on God. Remember, he's walking on water. It's nothing to do with Peter. It's all because of God. God gave him the strength. God gave him the ability. God called him, and God made it work. Peter was simply obeying. He wasn't doing anything special on his behalf. It wasn't because of him. It was because of God. And when God calls us to do something and we obey, he gives us the strength that we need. We always want to just know what the end result's going to be, not the strength to walk through the storm. But Peter was focusing on God, and God gave him the strength to walk through the storm. And it wasn't until Peter took his eyes off of God that he began to sink. And for us in our lives, how often are we walking through things that are trying to pull our focus away from God? And the moment we start to take our focus off of God, things start to get trickier. Have you ever noticed that? Suddenly you're not 100% sure how to handle a situation. Or suddenly you start to question more. You start to wonder more. You get more tired. You're already tired enough. I know for me, the times that I'm most stressed are the times that I have forgotten to go back to God and pray when a situation happens. Now, let me make this very clear. The storm does not go away because I'm focused on God. The storm is still there. Whatever's trying to pull my attention is still trying to pull my attention. It's still life. The difference is I'm looking to God and he's giving me strength. But we've all been pulled away from focus. That's normal. And that's where this last part, and the part that I want to land on, really comes into play. When Peter took his eyes off of Jesus, which will happen, and we need to give ourselves a little bit of grace for the times that we get distracted from God. Because you're human. It's going to happen. He didn't look back to the boat and ask the disciples for help. He didn't try and swim on his own or dog paddle for a while in a storm. He immediately cried back out to God. He had faith to obey. He had faith focusing on God. And he had faith to turn back to God. He remembered what put him there in the first place, how he got there, who was giving him the strength to do what he was doing, and he turned back to God when he needed him. I know for me, a lot of times, this becomes an issue of control. My life, my situation, it's what I want. I'm in control. And if I can't figure it out, I'm going to keep trying until I do figure it out. And if things get hard, I'm just going to work harder. And if this happens, I'm just going to do this. And I just start going crazy, driving myself nuts, wondering, hey, God, where are you? Why is this hard? Or why is this happening? Or why am I distracted? Or why am I struggling right now because I can't seem to... And then when I finally remember to pause for a moment and to sit down at my desk where I don't have the TV in front of me, my desk faces away from the TV for a reason, and just take some moments to pray, suddenly I feel some calmness. Suddenly I have a peace. And it's not because I'm this special person. It's because I'm focusing on God again. He's giving me the strength. He's giving me the peace. When I open my eyes and I'm done praying, that situation still exists. That distraction is still there. I still got to figure out what I'm going to do. But I've put my focus back where it needs to be. Because when I'm focused on God, I can walk through the storm with His strength. But if I'm only trying to do it in my own strength, I'm going to be dog paddling in a storm. And I'll get exhausted quickly. Anyone ever tried to swim in a storm or when the waves are really rough? It is exhausting. Even if you're a strong swimmer. And see, there's a pattern here that I want to make sure we see as I start to wrap this up. Peter obeyed God. Peter focused on God. Peter turned his back to God. He didn't turn his back, sorry. Peter turned his focus back to God, not turn his back on God. It's all about God. It's all about God. Not about me. Not about how great I am in certain situations. It's not about what I think I can handle. It's about God. It's about my faith in Him, my trust in Him, being willing to obey what He says, even if I don't understand it, even if I can't see the outcome, even if it doesn't make any sense, because He's calling me to walk through something I don't really want to walk through. Or He challenges me and says, hey, jump out of the boat. Yeah, but God, I can't walk on water. And see, it's not always huge, miraculous things either. We're called to obey God every single day, even in the little things of daily living. But it's that daily practice of obedience that strengthens our faith, that gives us the focus on God, so that when we get to those big things, He's strengthened our faith and He's prepared us. When I was in college, I played soccer. And I know I played it because I went to a really small Bible college and they needed people to play. Not because I'm an amazing soccer player. I had actually never played soccer other than in the backyard until I got to college. And then I ended up playing 2 years on the team. And I loved it. It was great. I got some interesting stories because I grew up playing football. And slightly different sports. They wouldn't let me tackle people. I got several red cards my first year. And I was like, hey, I'm just out here running around. But I remember it was my sophomore year, and school was difficult. I was having a rough time with school. I was having a rough time personally with some different things. I was having a hard time staying focused on God. I was working at a church part-time, but struggling there. It just seemed like life was not going the way I thought it was. And I wanted to get away. And we had a tournament. I went to school in Omaha, Nebraska. We had a tournament in Dallas, Texas. So it was like an 8-hour drive, and we were going to be there all weekend. And I could not wait to go because I needed to get away for a weekend, to get away from normal life and just kind of reset. And if you've ever been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So the bus is leaving at 7 a.m. because we got a long drive. I'm so excited to go. I made sure I packed the night before. I woke up at 6 a.m. because I wanted to be first one down there, ready to get on the bus. So I get up, I get dressed, I make sure I'm ready to go. I got my stuff packed. I sit down on my couch. I'm like, all right, I got a little bit of time to wait. Next thing I know, it's 9 o'clock and I'm waking up on my couch. They forgot me and they left. Just another thing happening in my life. Right? It's always just one more thing. So they had miscounted because they were taking extra people since it was a longer trip, and they thought I was on the bus, and I wasn't. So I was less than happy, and I unpacked in a very less than happy way. Took me a while to find everything later on because I was throwing stuff all over the place. If you've ever been like that, I get a phone call after I'm done unpacking, and it's my coach. He goes, hey, we're in Kansas. And you're not here. Yeah, that's about all I can muster up to say without losing it. Like, yeah, I know. He gives me the address to the hotel. He's all right, meet us there. Okay. So I have a car. I did have a car, but this was for barely getting around campus. This wasn't going to take me a 9-hour trip to Texas. This would have died barely leaving Omaha. But the girl I was seeing at the time had a nice car, so I traded with her. She used my car for the weekend. I took her car, and I drove for 9 hours by myself to Dallas, Texas. And if you've ever done that drive, I know that we're in a different part of the country. There is a stretch of a couple of hours where there's not even a radio station because you're so in the middle of nowhere. Which, if you've ever been at that point where you're about to just lose it, and you're asking God what's going on, and you're struggling, silence is the last thing you want. You want to be distracted. But I'm driving, no radio, no music, nothing. I'm just sitting there thinking, struggling, praying, and this verse keeps coming to my head. It's a verse I knew well, but it kept coming to my mind. And it came to my mind, and I was like, yeah, God, I know that verse. Let me get back to complaining to you. And he would bring it again. Yeah, no, I know that verse. You're not listening to me, God. And it just kept getting louder and louder in my head, almost like I could actually hear it. Like I couldn't think of anything else. And finally, I realized God was trying to get my attention. The verse is this, Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The New American Standard Version says, cease striving and know that I am God. And that's what kept running through my head over and over and over and over. And I thought I was going crazy and over. And I had to realize that I had been walking through a storm, trying to figure out how to swim back to the boat by myself instead of just looking back to God. There were some things in my life that I needed to correct because I wasn't being obedient in certain areas. I wasn't looking to God the way that I should. And I was at the end of my rope. And God kept reminding me, hey, be still. Cease striving. Quit trying. And remember that I'm God. You're not. See, that's where that issue of control comes in. We want to be God in our own life. We want the control. We think we have the strength. And it was God who was reminding me, hey, you need me. I'm God. You're not. You need to look to me for this strength. You need to refocus back on me. You need to cry out to me again so that I can walk through this storm with you. Life is full of storms all around us. And again, I'm not using storm in just a bad way, but there's anything that's around us that's distracting us. Can be that metaphor of a storm. Things in our life that are going on that are overwhelming us. We're so busy. We're so distracted. We have a million things to do, and we can only get to 2 of them. And we're feeling overwhelmed and behind, and it's just more than we can handle. Those kind of storms, we need to remember to obey what God says. Because that's where this is going to begin. Peter walked on water, not because Peter could walk on water. It's because he obeyed God, and God gave him the strength to walk on water. We need to put our focus back on God if there's places where it's been pulled away from him. And we need to keep looking to him. And in those times where we sink, those times where we struggle, we need to put down our pride, stop thinking we have to be in control, and we need to cry out to God again. Say, God, I need your help. Take a moment and pray about it. The situation won't change, but suddenly he will give you the strength. You will have the peace you need to walk through it. Because he is God. and we are not. He is stronger than the storm. He is greater than all the distractions. And if we're going to make it through any of those things, we need him. Because he is God, and we are not. Cease striving and know that I am God. Let's close in prayer. God, life is hard, and that's an understatement. And we need you, and that's an understatement. And sometimes we forget those things, and we try to do it on our own. God, may we all have moments in our lives where you get our attention and pull our focus back on you. May we learn from Peter to obey you, to focus on you. And then when we do get distracted, to immediately turn back to you. Thank you that you are God. Thank you that you are there for us when we cry out to you, just like you were for Peter. It's in your name that I pray. Amen.